let's examine some of the most important acts or laws that Congress has created to kind of protects our checks and balance system and keeps the government on track and protects us as citizens. An act, just to be clear, all it is a bill that has passed through the legislative steps, so through the House and the Senate, or vice versa, the Senate and the House, and then became a law. It was signed by the president into law. So both the House of Representatives and the president himself has actually signed this into law. A rider is an addition to a bill that does not have to do with an original bill at hand. So this is what people be like, oh, that's why, Congress can be really shady, because you think we might have something that sounds really amazing like this bill, Civil Rights Act of 1964, and we find out that there was a couple of riders snuck in there by the House of Reps or the Senate, and it was signed into law, and it was riding through this to become a law on things that have nothing to do with Civil Rights Act of 1964. So, for example, we have, and a lot of times we don't know about these riders until the bill actually becomes law, and then we find out, oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe this, but there's a tax cut for wealthy corporations in the Civil Rights Act. Now, a lot of times this could be through compromise, where the Democrats or Republicans, for example, on the stimulus packages passed during COVID-19, one of the things is they had this $500 billion basically where the president got to sign to spend we don't know where under their Trump administration, and they weren't really clear. $500 billion, not million. However, maybe the Democrats side off and allowed these riders to get through, and maybe some of this money went to companies or corporations, and they allowed it so that they could get the $1,200 out to every American citizen and $600 for the children. And they thought the ends kind of justify the means. But a lot of these riders pop their head after the law is already passed, and then we just have to deal with the consequences. So let's look at how the Congress and the president have tried to actually regulate themselves. First of all, you have the Pendleton Act, very important, 1883. It eliminates the spoils system of patronage, which was up until 1883 to say that the government was based on cronyism and corruption and who knew who is an understatement. The spoils system was everywhere. If it wasn't in New York with all these bosses working sometimes with organized crime like mafia situations, the corruption was just everywhere. And that's one of the things that really challenges democracy. And we see that in other countries today. Like Russia has a lot of corruption. China has some corruption. Even if they claim to be democracies, if it's really based on companies that have the most money and there's things done underneath the table and there's no transparency, it basically challenges or destroys the whole concept of democracy, where we understand who's ruling what. And if they do a bad job, we can fire them. If they're doing a good job, we can hire them. I suppose we don't know what's going on. And some people have addressed this with President Trump. Was he against the Pendleton Act when he was putting his son-in-law in charge, his daughter? He was putting all these high-ups in his family members in high-up positions in the executive branch. Is that against the Pendleton Act? And a lot of people thought yes. However, the enforcement wasn't very strong on this. So that's a spoiled system. Is, remember, you take care of your buddies that help you get where you're at. You owe them something. Like, I owe you. He did, in fact, put Betsy DeVos in charge of the education department, and she is a really good example of a spoiled system. While she did have some education experience only in charter schools, she didn't have it in the true public sector. And a lot of educators were upset about that. So what we've instilled is exam-based merit systems. You think about the Chinese invented the exam or the test, and I know most students can't stand them, but the idea is that I have a standardized test in my class that everybody has an equal chance at, and you have to make some choices on if you're going to study for it or come work with the teacher or pay attention, or if you're not going to take it very serious or you're going to take it really serious, so that you earn it based on some kind of merit or qualifications. And that's the same thing. In bureaucracies, now almost everybody in the bureaucracy is an expert in what they do. We only find the spoil system as a big concern under the Pendleton Act is at the top. Is the actual person in charge of the Department of Labor, are they actually somebody that understands economics and labor? They've studied labor unions and worked with them. That's an important point. So the Sherman Antitrust Act, Very important, and these are just kind of reminders from American history. Sherman Antitrust Act was this law that was to provide Congress with authority to regulate and break up the monopolies. Remember, this goes back to the Gilded Age when things were just out of control. The monopolies and the trusts, which were companies that worked together to keep prices low and put the other competition out. So like Quick Trip and Mobil would get together and put all the other, and they would drop their gasoline to $1 a gallon. Meanwhile, all the other gas stations in the St. Louis area would have to stay at $2 a gallon. We're all going to go to Mobil or Quick Trip, and then when they go out of business, then the trust can jack the prices up and control the market. So in the United States, it's abused, however, to break up, and it was also used to break up labor unions. So if you monopolize an industry like on Amazon, Walmart has done a great job of this, where Walmart's, one of the number one employers in the United States. They have over 1 million employees. They're very anti-union. So they can't, there has been no unionization under Walmart. In fact, I think there was some unionization starting in Canada, because there's Walmarts in Canada, and I've actually been to Canada and a Walmart. I had to get an oil change one time because I had some problems. And there are no unions. Actually, they've closed Walmarts that started to unionize rather than deal with a union and pushing back on labor. So this Sherman Antitrust Act is very, very important. The Hatch Act, you'll hear the Hatch Act reference, is permitting government employees to vote in government elections. So originally, government employees really weren't even supposed to vote, and you weren't supposed to be in parties and all this stuff. And it got really confusing under the Pendleton Act. And what happened in the end, though, is we said, yes, you could vote if you're a public employee. I mean, we've talked about how there's still media. There's people that think they're truly objective journalists that refuse to vote. Because they want to be truly objective and not show any bias politically. Well, in the Hatch Act, this idea is that people in bureaucracies are not actually supposed to be loyal to parties. They should be loyal to America. If you saw the inauguration, the president puts his hand on a Bible, and he swears an oath to the Constitution of the United States. So this limited government is above all. Okay, so then we're going to move on to the next slide. All right, so some other ways we regulate governments and industries. You got the Federal Elections Act, and we've talked about the FECC, which is the Federal Elections Commission, and it created and it's interesting, this came out in 1971 and was elaborated on or added on in 1974, and of course, if you remember what happened in 1971, Richard Nixon was in trouble with Watergate and trying to steal an election by breaking into the Democratic headquarters, and he knew about it and got information from it. So, and we have tapes of this and evidence. So what happened is the Congress stepped in and had the next president, Gerald Ford, pass legislation to put limits on contributions to campaigns and starting to regulate and watch out on the actual how much money you get as a campaign when you're running for a campaign, and who gets what money, and trying to get more fair campaign situations. So it also opens up the idea that a third or fourth parties could actually compete, because if the system was based solely on money, then it'll completely be dominated by the Democrats or Republicans. And we've talked about how that's been reversed a lot by the Supreme Court, that we have Citizens United case, which flipped this. And they said, nope. It's under freedom of speech. You can spend as much money as you want. But here's the caveat, because of the Federal Elections Commission Act, you can't give the money to the campaign directly of the candidate, but you can spend as much as you want in a pact on other, that doesn't work or correlate or talk to the campaign. So you can spend $10 million or even $1 billion on helping Donald Trump win the election. You just can't coordinate with this campaign under the FECA or the Federal Elections Campaign Act. Can't do that because it's limited in how much you have the Control Act, established Congress with budget committees, congressional budget offices. Very important that this looks at the money and actually looks into the details, because we had a lot of bills that were just being passed and the money is being spent, and a lot of times accountability wasn't as good as it could have been, and we didn't. So it refused to fund congressional initiatives known as impoundment. This is an important one. You want to have budget and regulations watching over this, controlling it. You have the Graham, Rudman, and Hollins bill in 1985. This set budget reduction targets to balance the budget. So we've had this objective that to actually balance this budget. There's a lot of loopholes, obviously, because we're now at something like $25 trillion deficit, which is pretty scary. Because who's going to pay for it? You guys. I guess the good news is that the United States is probably not going anywhere. The bad news is if we keep losing credibility economically with other countries, nobody's going to lend us money. Okay, you got the Freedom of Information Act, very important, 1966, declassified government documents for the public use. That's how we get a hold of things like the Pentagon Papers, and we can actually read this stuff. And so a lot of times you're like, well, where do you get your information from, Mr. Metropolis? Very good question. Well, I try to read historians that pull out pieces of primary sources that have actually come from legislation and government actions that have been revealed. So I can say with confidence, for example, I know that the CIA has been tried to rig the election in Nicaragua, that we've been involved in supporting Pinochet, which was a dictator in Chile, that we've done many things. And the reason I know this is because I've read historians that broke down or went to primary sources myself that tells us that we did that. And even CIA and FBI documents, after so much time, they get declassified. And that's why you can now look at the stuff about the Kennedy assassination. And actually, it's probably not as interesting as people thought it would be when it came out. You have the Air Quality Act. That's pretty self-explanatory at the beginning of the series. It wasn't until 1967 we start trying to regulate air quality on a federal level. It's kind of scary to think about. I mean, people used to die from smog and pollution from factories all the time. People died from cancer. People still do. If you live closer to a factory, you're much more likely to have health issues or cancer. And you got the War Powers Act. And if you guys remember this last year when we did Vietnam, this was really set after LBJ and the whole Vietnam War. And it was to limit the president's power to send troops overseas. And not Vietnam and Korea. Korea was more of a United Nations act, but Vietnam was a direct presidential action. Under the Gulf of Tonkin, the president basically had free reign to send troops in, and he did. He didn't just send a couple of troops in. We're talking over 500,000 Americans were in Vietnam at one point, and over the years, hundreds of thousands of men and women served because he started a draft, and we never declared a war. So now under the Wars Powers Act, that's not supposed to be happening, and we limited it. But still, this has been brought back under the Patriot Act. And remember, we talked about that 60 words, where basically a president, if he sees a threat, he can send troops in almost immediately. You have the Espionage Act and Sedition Act from World War I. Very important laws. Sedition Act has actually been repealed. It's gone. However, the Espionage Act is still being used today. We'll hear episodes on NPR. We'll talk about how people get arrested for talking about guns or anything associated with terrorism. And under the Espionage Act, they could be checked and charged under threatening the security of the country, especially in a time of war. Well, that really brings up some good questions because right now we're still in war, aren't we? Now, it's not declared by Congress, but Afghanistan is the longest war in the history of the country. So we'll find under the Patriot Act, they could, which is an extension of the Espionage Act, you can get charged with both. Now they could search your house without they're supposed to have probable cause, but they don't have to present it to a judge or get a warrant to actually kick in your door and come look in your house if they suspect you of being a terrorist, a foreign terrorist. And that raises questions about domestic terrorism. Is this Espionage Act applicable? It doesn't seem for domestic terrorism unless it has some connection with overseas that's being taken as serious. I don't know, though. These are good arguments you could have in court, and people argue one way or another. You get the Immigration Act 1924. This is really, we talked about, it's the end, essentially, of the idea that we are not going to have quota, or we're just going to let anybody come to the United States. And you remember last year, we learned that the Chinese Exclusion Act excluded the Chinese and banned Chinese from coming to America in the late 1800s. But the Immigration Act, but after that, the Chinese could start immigrating to America again. The Immigration Act has actually put strict limited numbers of immigrants. So now we're at something like 1 million immigrants. And actually, under the Trump administration, it was under 1 million people a year were coming to the United States. And we have quotas, and that is a result of nativism and anti-immigration. But also, there's some valid questions in there. When do you have too much immigration? or how many legal immigrants can we allow into the country. But on the other side of it, immigration's pretty positive economically. And then there's been bias towards certain immigrants. Like in St. Louis, we have a lot of immigration in the county, but they tend to be very educated immigrants that are coming into the country. Like there'll be a professor for Bayer, or there'll be a doctor instead of just a regular person that has to get training or provide some kind of service. You got the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is about as big as it gets. Now that suspends literacy tests, empowered federal officials to register voters, and it's related to job performance. Okay, so the Voting Rights Act. So I want you to think about that. And this protects people for voting. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is phenomenal. It's supposed to end discrimination on a federal level, and now people can make claims federally they're being discriminated, and there's a law to protect them. But the Voting Rights Act is actually where the federal government protects your right to vote. So in certain states where there's a history of trouble with this, like Mississippi, Alabama, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Texas, we'll actually have people going into voting booths on the federal level and making sure things are safe. And they might be undercover, or they might be there publicly to make sure that everybody's safe, that the Klan's not showing up, or white supremacists, or somebody's threatening people of color and trying to intimidate for the right to vote. Also, if an employer is trying to infringe on your right to vote, now you can take some legal action against them. In Missouri, they have to let you vote. They have to give you a 3-hour window. You should have at least 3 hours to vote before or after work. Otherwise, they have to let you leave work on the day of voting day and give you 3 hours to go vote and come back. They do not have to pay you. However, they do have to let you leave without consequence, or you could sue them under Missouri law. All right. We did these guys. Okay, you got Age Discrimination Act. Very important. Just because somebody's older, I've heard people say, okay, boomer. Here's the thing, though. Are you being discriminatory? How is that not discrimination if you're not trusting somebody in a position, or you're treating somebody older like they're not intelligent, or they're just not with it? That's not fair either. Obviously, President of the United States, 78 years old, I think a lot of people think he's doing a good job. I don't think that's a fair discrimination. You can't just discriminate just because age is something everybody goes through. It's not skin color or religion. And it is against the law, just to be clear. So you see somebody discriminating against somebody older at work, it could be a violation of the Age Discrimination Employment Act. You have the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. That's an extension of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This provided what's called Title II, ban discrimination in public places on the basis of race, color. So this really clarifies that if it prohibits employees from discriminating based on gender as well. It clarifies and adds on to Civil Rights Act. So in public, if somebody's discriminated against at a store, you could probably sue them with the Civil Rights Act of 1968. The one in 64 was more about workplaces. If you and your job can't be discriminated. But let's say somebody refuses to cut your hair because you're African American. I don't know how to do African American hair. Well, that's discrimination. That's against the law. Under the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Can't do that. Title IX, very important. We'll talk more about this when we get into civil rights unit. Title IX is the Education Act of 1972, prohibited gender discrimination in federally funded education programs. Okay? So this one is prohibiting gender discrimination, especially in anything that's federal funding. And this is very important. So schools are federally funded. Public schools. Charter schools are federally funded. So if it's a public school that receives any federal monies, it cannot discriminate against males or females. So we'll talk much more about this, but this has to do with sports programs as well. So you can't have more than one more boy or female program at a high school. Okay? Also, you can't have all boy or all female high schools if they receive federal funds, which we do. So schools, while they could maybe have all boy, all girl classes, that's kind of playing with it. Might be able to get away with that, but you can't have an all boy, all girl school. And the only reason these things happen is nobody sues. So if nobody sues or nobody challenges a law, then that people are just breaking the law. And you have to understand that you can't just break laws. And that's why when you guys, as citizens, when you become adults, it's important that you say, hey, no, that's not right. You can't break that law. And if you don't like a law, why don't you go change the law? Protest, petition like civil rights leaders, and make a change. All right, guys. See you next